Hey, I want to make a film review. Haven't done that for a while, and I think this is a film that's very topical for some of today's issues. The Butler. It's not a new film. It was released in 2013. Um, I'm watching it right now. In fact, I've just paused the screen because I've just watched the most powerful scene in the film, and I'd like to talk about the film as it's kind of fresh in my mind. So this film's directed by Lee Daniels and it stars Forest Whitaker in the title role. It's very loosely based, and I'm saying that for a reason, on the White House butler Eugene Allen, who was in the White House during seven presidencies from Eisenhower to Reagan. Um, but other than that, there is a lot of artistic license in the film. Um, if you look at the back, it says three BAFTA Award nominations, three Screen Actor Guild Award nominations. However, it didn't, from what I see, get any say in the Academy Awards of 2014. Um, there's a lot of things I can say about this film. Firstly, as I say with all my film reviews, if you haven't seen the film, there is spoilers in this review. So this is more for people who have seen it and just kind of sharing my thoughts. I actually think this is a very powerful and very moving film. I'm going to say a quick few things about the historical inaccuracies because it's one of the main criticisms of this film, and perhaps that's the reason why it didn't get more acclaim. Firstly, I would say there's very, very, very few historical films that don't have at least one or two inaccuracies. So, a few examples. In the film, his name is Cecil Gaines, as opposed to the historical character Eugene Allen. In the film, there's a very big emphasis on a rift with his son, who becomes increasingly more radical. I should say, as if it isn't obvious, he is a black man working in the White House. This is during the civil rights era, and in the film, his son becomes very radical. Gradually, joins Black Panthers, or at least black radical movements, or black liberation movements, whatever you want to call them. Now, in reality, that was never the case. Um, in the film, he has two sons. In real life, the real life character had one son. In the film, he's born in Georgia. In real life, the real Eugene Allen was born in Virginia. In the film, his mother is raped and his father is murdered by the plantation owner or plantation owner's son. That never happened in real life. So there is a lot of artistic license for dramatic effect for the film. Um, Now, usually I'm quite critical of historical inaccuracies. Oh, one more thing that was heavily criticized was the portrayal of Ronald Reagan by Alan Rickman. And that would be one of Rickman's last roles, incidentally. But the criticism was in the fact that the film portrayed Reagan as indifferent to civil rights and indifferent to the situation of apartheid South Africa. Well, Reagan's family, understandably, but more significantly, his White House staff have criticized that and said that Reagan was passionately for civil rights and far from indifferent. Um, I don't know what to make of that. I mean, clearly, there's going to be people who are biased towards a particular president if they were in close association with him. And of course, his family's going to defend him. Perhaps it was a little bit unfair in its depiction of Reagan. But the thing about this film is it only has a certain amount of time for each president. And I don't think it can really divulge in depth every president. I mean, there was also criticism of John Cusack as Nixon. Actually, I should say Alan Rickman's role wasn't criticized, not his acting. Cusack, although he's one of my favorite actors, his role was criticized. A lot of people kind of almost mocked him saying that he thought he was auditioning for Elvis rather than Richard Nixon. It's it's an almost caricature Nixon. I actually think Cusack's a very good actor. Um, but he sort of portrayed the 1950s Nixon more like the 1970s Nixon. Although, to be fair, I think Nixon's a very hard role to play. And you have John Cusack, who's a relatively young actor, still in his 40s, playing Nixon, who, when he was in the White House, was well into his 50s. So that's a real challenge. Not sure who the guy is playing JFK. Um, but it's an all-star cast. Oprah Winfrey plays his wife. Like I said, John Cusack as Richard Nixon. Um, there's roles by Jane Fonda, Cuba Gooding Jr., Terrence Howard, Lenny Kravitz, James Mars. James Marsden played JFK. I think he's done that before. David Oyelowo, who recently played Martin Luther King in Selma. I might add one of our best actors. Played his son, the Black Panther figure. Vanessa Redgrave played the mother of the racist plantation owner. Um, Robin Williams plays Eisenhower. Robin Williams, great actor, very good at that role. Um, and it doesn't feature every president in detail. For example, Carter and Ford just shows in passing footage. What I would say about this film is I think it's a great overview of the civil rights era. So, okay, it is inaccurate. There's no escaping that. But leave aside the inaccuracies, and it is actually a very good, in my view, portal overview of what the civil rights era was like because it did divide the black community. This is something that's sometimes forgotten between those who wanted to follow the Martin Luther King approach and those who wanted to follow a more radical approach. Now, there could be endless debate over which approach was right or wrong, but there is scenes in the film. In fact, the scene I've just watched is very, very hard to watch, but very moving. And I always feel in a film, if you find a particular scene hard to watch, that is the power of cinema. Basically, the scene shows, like I say, a son's gradually getting involved in the civil rights movement, and whereas his father wants to basically stay out of it because he feels a gradual kind of movement is better. But basically, the scene is really hard to watch because it shows the son along with university friends in the deep south. I think it's Fisk University. I don't know if that's Tennessee or Mississippi, but they go into a diner and they refuse to sit in the colored only area. So gradually they're told to leave, and the staff are getting edgy, and it's a very, very tense scene. But in the background, it shows them kind of training for the confrontation. So the civil rights coaches, mentors, leaders, kind of training them for the confrontation they would face. And the hardest bit about the scene is you're seeing these very, very brave young people sitting there and taking all this shit, some really, really ugly, vicious racism. I mean, it shows this gang of white racist thugs coming in, male and female, and just like basically verbally harassing them. There's one scene where one girl gets tomato ketchup and sprays it in girl's face. But what I like about that scene is I don't like the scene. It's not easy to watch, but what I think is powerful about the scene and poignant is it shows a young white man who was joining in with these black students, and he was taking just as much abuse. He was being called a race traitor, you love the N word, etc. And I think that's very, very important. And I really appreciate that Lee Daniels has given a very wide scope to that side of things. Because one thing that irritates me about the likes of the Black Lives Matter movement and so on today, and a lot of frankly black supremacists, is they forget that there were many white people involved in the civil rights movement. And there were white people, by the way, murdered during the civil rights movement. I forget what her name was, but there was an Italian American woman from the Bronx. She went down to the Deep South to help Martin Luther King and, aid the civil rights movement after the March on Selma. She was murdered by Klansmen. So this wasn't just tokenism by white liberals. These were brave people trying to do the right thing, and they were facing personal threats to do so. So I really wish sometimes I come across comments on the internet, and okay, I'm going beyond the remit of this film review, but I think it's important to say. And I read things like "you whites this" and "you whites that," and it's like a demonization of the entire white race because of the action of white supremacists. That really fucks me off, quite frankly. Because as a white man, I abhor all racism, and the way black people were treated in the past, especially, was disgusting and abhorrent. And I'm saying that. So it just really, really irritates me when some black Americans demonize the entire white race and say, you people done this, without acknowledging the fact that there were many white people actively supporting the civil rights movement. But it also shows the complexities and the pressure that a lot of the black community faced at the time over which direction to take. And in retrospect, it is important that those of us who are critical of Black Power movements understand why it came about, because they were looking at the Martin Luther King approach. And the film shows this gradual sort of evolution, or whatever you want to call it, from kind of the passive approach. And then these young people think, wait a second, this is a waste of time. Kind of like the approach Nelson Mandela took, actually, because Nelson Mandela started off as a pacifist. He ended up more with the direct action approach. But it is important that those of us who are critical of Black Power understand why it came about, because it was human nature. Martin Luther King is rightly venerated, but the problem with the pacifist approach was it was basically asking people to take physical violence and not stand up for themselves in that sort of assertive way. So I guess they were looking at it like, this man stood up for civil rights, he ended up getting shot. So I think there were deep divisions within the black community at the time about the right approach to take. The problem is the likes of the Black Panthers and so on only ended up marginalizing people. They marginalized the black community and they polarized white liberals who were supportive, not just white liberals, white people. It wasn't just liberals, white people who were sympathetic to the movement. I mean, um, what's his name? I forget the actor's name, but I'll give Clint Eastwood as an example. You could hardly call him a liberal. As far as I know, he was involved in the civil rights movement, as were a number of other white actors at the time. Um, so it's a very powerful and thought-provoking film. Yes, it's full of inaccuracies, but I think that could almost be forgiven because the film is so powerful at what it does. The Kennedy scene, it doesn't show the assassination, but it's very effective in how it deals with that, because it kind of shows Kennedy speaking with like on the TV, and then kind of that morphing into the news footage of his assassination. Very clever. LBJ, by the way, I forgot to mention LBJ. Not sure the actor that plays him. I think it's Leaf Schreiber. Not sure, but anyway, LBJ is whichever actor's playing him. Very, very good at the role. It's one of the best depictions of LBJ I've ever seen. Although Tom Wilkinson done a very good portrayal in Selma. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure there's other things I can mention. The Butler, very good film. Yes, it has inaccuracies, but it's a very thought-provoking film. And to me, it's a very, very good insight into the civil rights era. Also, I like the fact that his character in the end kind of joins the son, because he sort of ends up in a situation, and I guess this again comes into the criticism of the segment of the Reagan presidency, but it kind of shows him then, because there's a huge rift between father and son. But in the end of the film, the father kind of thinks all the time the son was right. I will say one thing: the film's been accused of being left wing and having a liberal bias. I'm not sure about that, because it depicts Eisenhower, a Republican president, in a pretty good light. Because there's a dialogue where Cecil Gaines says, the character Cecil Gaines, of course, again based on Eugene Allen, he says, "That's the first time I saw a white man sticking his neck out for black people," referring to Eisenhower's decision to send the National Guard into Montgomery. Um, so yeah, it's a very powerful film, and I think underrated. Forest Whitaker has, he's pretty good at the role. Um, so yeah, check it out, The Butler. Very good film and very thought provoking.